welcome to Another Day, Another Evil. I'm your host, Melissa.
And I'm Gina, and today it's my turn to bring you a solved case. As always, listener discretion is advised, as there may be some content that isn't suitable for younger listeners. So, imagine a locked hotel room, no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and yet inside a man lies dead, with injuries that don't make sense. This is the story of Greg Fleniken and the questions that refuse to stay buried. So he was born Gregory Joseph Fleniken on the 26th of December 1954 to Carol Fleniken and Jane Fleniken. So Carol's his father.
Okay.
He grew up in Lafayette, Louisiana, with his two sisters Cindy and Sondra and his brother Michael. So he lived in Louisiana with his wife Susie Aycock Fleniken and was vice president of OGM Land Company in Beaumont, Texas, where he worked during the week. On the 15th of November 2010, Greg Fleniken was in a hotel room as normal watching a movie when he received an email from his wife shortly after 7 p.m, which he responded to. Nothing about the trip raised concern. Colleagues saw him, conversations were normal, there were no arguments, no signs of stress, and no indication that anything was wrong. Susie, his wife, expected her regular call from her husband in the morning, and when that didn't come, she called his office. His co-workers, who were beginning to become worried about his absence too, drove to his hotel room, knocked and waited. When there was no answer, hotel staff entered the room, and inside they found Greg Fleniken dead. He was alone. Soon the room was swarming with police and medics, just a quiet, warm hotel room, and a body, who was found face down on the rug and a spent cigarette in his left hand. But the scene was confusing. There was no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture. His wallet and money, a stack of $100 bills, were still in his back pocket, so robbery was quickly ruled out, and there was no wounds suggesting violence. At first it looked like a natural death, a heart attack perhaps, something sudden and explainable. Susie knew Greg smoked and drank his whole life, not to excess, but something that he freely did, so she was ready to accept that his death was caused by something similar. Then came the autopsy. During the examination, the coroner, Dr. Tommy Brown, made a discovery that would change everything. At first glance, the body showed no sign of violence, except a graze on his cheek where he hit the rug, and a small laceration on his scrotum, causing bruising up through his groin area. But after further inspection, Greg had multiple fractured ribs, heavy internal damage to his organs, and a hole in his heart, all caused by blunt force trauma. And here's where it becomes unsettling. These weren't typical fractures. There was no corresponding external injuries, no bruises, and no marks which would suggest blunt force trauma. It was as if the damage had come from inside. Dr. Brown had no other option than to write homicide as the manner of death. And Dr. Brown told Detective Apple that the injuries Greg had suffered were the kind usually found in crash victims or somebody found underneath a heavy object, both of which he was not. So that's where the questions began. How does that happen? How does somebody sustain such serious internal injuries without any visible signs of violence? Detective Scott Apple set out to question everyone around him in the hotel, his colleagues and family, to see if anyone saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. Nothing came of it, nothing out of the ordinary, and certainly no suspects. The official explanation struggled to keep up with the evidence. But nothing came out of it, nothing out of the ordinary, and certainly no suspects. The official explanation struggled to keep up with the evidence. 6 months in, Detective Apple, who had chased down every angle he could imagine, was stuck. There seemed to be no answers to any of the questions, most of all why. Greg appeared to have no enemies. Susie and Greg had been married for 15 years. His brother and colleagues said that he was liked in their company and he rarely intersected with anyone else's. He was usually in his room at the hotel by early evening and stayed there until the morning. Greg was a decent, honourable and successful man who people liked. So Detective Apple chased down leads and in the end came up with 2 theories. And do you think that you can guess any of them?
Probably an affair with it being in a hotel.
Yeah. So the first theory involved sex, and obviously with him having kind of the laceration found on his scrotum, that's kind of where that came from. So the maintenance man at the hotel where Greg was staying happened to be a sex offender, and I don't know why that was common knowledge and absolutely fine. Maybe he'd already paid his debts to society or whatever, but that seems to be kind of a commonality found in all of the research that I did, that it was just known that he was this sex offender.
Right, okay.
But the thought was that with the laceration found on Greg's scrotum, there was some sort of sexual fetish, potentially caused by a screwdriver, gone wrong. But the theory never gained enough momentum to get beyond the wild suspicion, even after all the time spent looking into it. And then the second involved a group of electricians that were staying in the room next door. So on the night that Greg died, maintenance records showed that in the early evening, Greg had inadvertently blown an electrical circuit whilst he was cooking, and I think it was like a bag of popcorn in the microwave or something like that. And it basically had caused an outage in his room and the surrounding rooms, so including the one next door. And that night, the group of electricians were drinking in their room, and the theory was that due to the electricity outage, the group might have knocked on Greg's door and potentially got out of hand, which I think, if you ask me, it's a little bit far-fetched. We all know it can all get out of hand pretty quickly. But yeah, I think from what all of the sources were saying with the investigation stuff, I don't understand how that kind of became one of the leading theories.
Surely the out of hand would have resulted in bruises and more than just
exactly
something on his scrotum.
Exactly. But again, after interviewing them, nothing came of it. So it ended up just being a man alone in a hotel room with injuries that shouldn't have ever existed. So with no arrests, no definite cause, no closure, the question remained, what happened in the room? And by the end of 2010, there were no new leads. And in November, the family, hoping to unearth something, put up a $50,000 reward, which again produced nothing. And sometimes the most unsettling mysteries aren't the one with too many clues, but the ones that don't have any. So it wasn't until the family hired a private detective, Ken Brennan, believing a fresh pair of eyes might have helped. He looked through all the case files and interview recordings and felt that he knew what happened. Ken Brennan was a former Long Island police officer and DEA special agent. Is that drugs? Drugs Enforcement Agency, isn't it? And I saw that he did work with the FBI, but some sources said it, some sources didn't.
Right.
So I don't exactly know, and obviously I don't really know all of the American kind of terminologies. I don't know if DEA is part of the FBI or what. So he was now a private detective living in Florida, and he had a reputation for solving tough cases. So Ken Brennan visited Susie in April, asking her a lot of hard questions regarding her and Greg. You know, the partner's always the first suspect, so he needed to figure out whether there was any turbulence in their relationships, any life insurance, etc., until he was certain that Susie had no motive. And then following this, he asked if there was anything that struck her as odd with the crime scene. Now, remember when I said that the room was warm? It wasn't like a big thing, I didn't make a big thing about it, but I made sure that I said that it was just a warm room. See, that surprised Susie because her husband always put the aircon on at night, so the room should have been cold.
Right.
So that struck her as odd. So pop a little pin in that, remember it for later on. So Ken Brennan met with Detective Apple to discuss the case at a sports bar, and then the following morning they went to visit the hotel room. So they looked over the crime scene photos, autopsy results, and all the other information gathered in the investigation. And P.I. Brennan thought that he'd cracked the case. So Ken Brennan confirmed with Susie that Greg always smoked using his right hand. And remember, his cigarette was in his left when he was found.
Okay.
And remember how she said he would crank up the AC at night? So that helped confirm the time of the death. So as Brennan explained to Detective Apple, The AC must have shut down when the circuit broke, and records showed that the repairman left Greg alive and well after fixing the circuit at around 8:30 p.m. And then the movie that he was watching presumably resumed. And the assumption that was come to was that Greg forgot to turn the AC back on. And it wouldn't have taken long for the room to become warm enough to notice. But by then, he was dead. So that kind of made them realise, like, the timeline a little bit, kind of put everything into place for them.
Okay, yeah.
And then the cigarette ruled out the idea that Greg was beaten somewhere else, even if it was just in the hall by the electricians. So Ken Brennan concluded that Greg would have gotten up from the bed after lighting his cigarette and then would have shifted it into his left hand to try and grab the door handle with his right, or do something with his right hand. During the questioning of other guests within the hotel, during the original investigation with Detective Apple, was where the answers lied, something which was overlooked. In the room adjacent to Greg's, there was a group drinking, and a guest, Aaron, stated that he heard a gunshot. But with no gun, no bullet, and no corroborating statements or evidence, Detective Apple just thought because they were drunk, it was a bit of a mix-up, it was a bang, it could have been anything else really, couldn't it? But it was here where Ken Brennan wouldn't let it slide. He insisted on going into the room again where Greg was killed for a closer look, but for a bullet more specifically. And after hours of searching, they found something that was easily overlooked, something that you could have easily explained away as a dent made from a door handle. Yet the door handle didn't quite match up. And to confirm their suspicions, they checked the room next door. In room 349, they found a badly patched up hole with dried toothpaste, one that could have come from a bullet.
Is this the room that the electricians were in, sorry?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And then they checked the trajectory from the hole, which pointed straight to the bed where Greg had been sitting. So Dr. Brown, remember the gentleman that examined Greg's body from head to toe, wasn't convinced. The bullet had entered through Greg's scrotum, the small laceration that was found there, and tore through him before leaving the hole in his heart. And after confirming Greg Fleniken died due to being shot, Brennan and Apple needed to catch their suspects, the guests in room 349, Tim Steinmetz and Lance Mueller. So they visited the pair in Wisconsin and met Steinmetz in an interview room where the two detectives were extremely nice to him. They just wanted to get a statement of what happened or what he said happened. They made sure that they got a few details wrong so that he had to change them. Okay. And then he signed the statement or signed the document as you would. And that's where the mood changed. It was then when Brennan told Steinmetz he had a problem because he'd just made a false police report and would end up going to jail. It was this that they hoped would get Steinmetz to tell the truth, and luckily it worked. So on the 1st of June 2011 was when the truth came out. Between Steinmetz and another one of his colleagues, Trent Pisano, the following story emerged. In their room, they were drinking beer and whiskey before Lance Mueller asked Trent Pisano to fetch him his 9mm pistol from his car. And when he returned, Mueller took the handgun and started playing with it. He was pointing it in Pisano's direction at the foot of the bed when it went off. Luckily, Pisano wasn't hurt, nor anybody else, they thought. But Mueller freaked out, and according to both Pisano and Steinmetz, he took the gun back to his car and then headed down to the bar. When Steinmetz and Mueller saw the police in the room the next day, they thought that they'd killed Greg, but didn't want to kind of come forward. Okay. And then, obviously, because the whole of the police investigation, they went on blunt force trauma, they kind of was like, well, it wasn't us, it obviously wasn't us, they've not found a bullet or anything like that. And then Detective Apple and PI Brennan got Steinmetz to call Mueller while they recorded it, and he confirmed that he stuck to the original count before saying that he was prompted by the police to give them the truth. So Steinmetz told Lance Mueller that the man next door died of a gunshot, which was when Mueller basically refused to believe it because it hadn't been in the news. So P.I. Brennan then flew out to Beaumont, Texas on the 29th of November 2012 for the sentencing of Lance Mueller following his no contest plea to manslaughter. So for anybody that doesn't know, a no contest plea means that the defendant accepts punishment for a crime without formally admitting guilt in the US. And since Mueller had patched up the bullet hole, hidden the gun, and didn't admit guilt, the judge gave him 10 years, half of what the law allowed. And the apology he offered in court came way too late. And it's likely that if he did come forward at any time before he was basically found guilty of it, he wouldn't have received a charge for manslaughter and probably wouldn't have ever gone to jail for it.
Yeah, I was just thinking 10 years seems harsh, but then when you said about the fact that they'd actually hidden it, I suppose it's that after action, isn't it, that's made, that is the crime.
Yeah. But yeah, it was kind of like the whole aftermath.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he never did admit guilt.
No.
He pleaded no contest. So he was saying there's evidence, there was enough evidence. And I think that the worry was that because it was an accident and because they didn't know that it was a gun that killed him for so long, I think the worry was that he was never gonna kind of get any time in jail. But I think luckily the judge was obviously feeling a bit stricter that day or whatever, because with that it kind of does come down to the judge, doesn't it, the sentencing. Whereas like I guess over here it seems so bizarre in the UK to think that like if he'd have come forward and admitted it, that he probably wouldn't have gone to jail. Like Ken Brennan really, really fought for it. Really fought for it on behalf of Susie. So Susie, his devoted wife, got to actually speak directly to Mueller in court the day that he was sentenced and said, quote, "I have waited over 2 years to look you in the face, eye to eye, and simply have the chance to speak to you directly. You would have never come forward with the truth. You murdered him. No, you didn't intentionally seek him out to murder him, but you murdered him. With every lie you told, with every intentional selfish deception, with every cover-up, over and over again. You saw his body taken out of the room in a body bag the next day. You knew you killed him. He meant nothing to you." And I'd like to end this episode by reading a passage from his obituary. Quote, "Greg will be remembered as a devoted son, a wonderful brother, a loving uncle, and a tremendous friend. He touched so many lives, even those who came into his life as a stranger. They certainly didn't leave that way. It was in this world where Greg could appreciate the sunsets, the sunrises, and was most happy when covered by a blanket of stars. Greg was a patient man who gave unconditional love and generosity to all who were lucky enough to meet and spend time with him." Thank you for joining us in listening to the case of Greg Fleniken. Join us next week for another case.
Thank you for listening to Another Day, Another Evil.
This show was written and hosted by Melissa and Georgina Scorer.
All of our sources can be found in the show notes.
Stay safe. Goodbye.